Daniel, we really appreciate you taking your time out tonight, especially in light of last night's Democratic primary in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, concerning the district attorney race there. Can you, just for some of our viewers and listeners who might not be too familiar with the local politics there and Larry Krasner specifically, can you just talk about sort of who he is, the unusual route that he took to become DA, which is already a sort of often obscured role in our politics, and how he sort of rose to fame?
Sure. So it's a very interesting moment right now for DA politics, for criminal justice politics. So just the big picture first for people who may not know who even Larry Krasner is. So in 2017, in the DA race, the race for chief prosecutor in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner won the primary and then the election. And that was very unusual because he had no experience himself as a prosecutor or in law enforcement writ large. His own experience was as a criminal defense attorney and a civil rights attorney. And he really ran, and he actually had already clashed for a long time with law enforcement, had filed lawsuits against law enforcement in Philly. And so his election was really a catalyst for a lot of conversations nationally around the role that prosecutors can play in changing the criminal legal system from the inside. You know, he's not the first person who ran on criminal justice reform in a DA race, but the fact that he was such an outsider to the system, in fact, the fact that he had spent his career fighting the system kind of changed the expectations of what is even possible to talk about in these elections. And over the past 4 years, Krasner has sort of remained kind of an emblem for the national effort to use DA offices to really change the criminal legal system. Frankly, both for its proponents. I've talked to so many candidates for prosecutor around the country over the past 3 years who have specifically said that Krasner's victory was inspiring to them. A lot of people who aren't prosecutors themselves who pointed to that victory as a reason why they thought it was even a thing for them to run for prosecutor, but also for the opponents of the criminal legal of reform. Bill Barr under the Trump years often pointed to Krasner as an example of the reform movement run amok. A lot of people in the police union, the police union in Philly was very, very hostile to Krasner and fought him for 4 years. And then that brings us to the election this week. To cut a long story short, when Krasner faced a former prosecutor who he himself had fired, effectively as soon as he came into office, Krasner fired some prosecutors, effectively saying your approach, your practices have been too in line with a very punitive approach, and he fired them. And then one of them ran against him this year, Carlos Vega, attracting support from the police union locally, and just a lot of attention nationally, a lot of articles written about whether the progressive movement is running out of breath, stuff like that. And then the result yesterday was that Krasner won with 65% of the vote. So that's kind of the arc of what just happened yesterday. And yeah, it's a big deal for these conversations around criminal justice reform right now.
Thanks, Daniel. And now you and your colleagues have done a great job, really, of detailing why this election is important from a policy perspective. Whether it's dismissing criminal charges for drug possession, reducing the number of people under community supervision, or overturning past criminal convictions. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about these policies in the context of his reelection and to the extent to which his primary opponent wanted to roll them back.
Yeah, that's a particularly great question when it comes to DA elections, because we are not used to talking about the policy that these people implement, right? It's often just about people for a long time just ran on things like I'm going to be fair or I'm going to be tough, and that's kind of the all that we got from prosecutors. And so it's very important for me and for our work at the Appeal to really drill down and explain to people, this is what a prosecutor does, this is what the prosecutor changes. So some of the examples you just mentioned are great examples. So one thing, for instance, that Krasner has done in office is effectively drop almost a growing share of the charges for drug possession. Effectively, he's saying that drug possession and addiction is not something for the criminal legal system to be involved with, that only makes things worse, that addiction, like bringing addiction into the court system like that is going to make things worse. And the data, we ran a chart of the soaring share of cases dropped for drug possession under Krasner's office. That is really in and of itself a telling illustration. I don't have it obviously next to me, but a telling illustration of just what a DA can do. And that's something, for instance, that Carlos Vega was talking about, using other ways of avoiding jail time or prison time and putting people in what's called drug courts, which are still a form of prosecution. But that was a form of contrast, for instance, that came up. Another form of contrast that came up was that DAs can protect immigrants from various sorts of immigration consequences. When someone who's not a citizen comes into contact with law enforcement or the court system, that can have very, very bad consequences for their immigration status if they're legal, and for their deportation if they're not. And Krasner had created an office within the DA's office to find ways to charge people or sentence people in a way that would circumvent the immigration consequences, right? So those are specific examples of the sort of powers these judges have. Obviously, then we can talk about seeking lower sentences, seeking lower bail for people to avoid pretrial detention, all sorts of things. And Vega's argument really was Krasner's attempts to lower incarceration were going to harm the city. That was effectively a tougher on crime argument. Though, and I will end here, what's interesting in the election, really, I think, is that Vega, in some ways, was not fully embracing that old school tough on crime message. He was running with the support of the police union, and he was having all this like national coverage of whether reform versus tough on crime is more appropriate. But in a lot of the things he said, he wasn't fully embracing the idea that he wanted to reverse Krasner's policies, as though the movement has come so far, the conversation has come so far that we're no longer in 2017 or in 2013, and those same arguments will no longer hold sway.
Yeah, Daniel, I'm glad you mentioned that. Just, I don't think you can underscore enough or exaggerate the role that the union played in trying to knock out Krasner in the primary. They even did some gimmicky stuff that I think people chuckled at, like the Mr. Softy thing outside his office, right? But it's interesting, as you just mentioned, this is another Democrat that they were supporting, that potentially, if it's Democrat-Republican, they might pull their endorsement just because of the actual policies that are more aligned with this 2021 version of criminal justice. So just from the political aspect, I don't know what observers are saying, but do they see as the police union's power sort of diminished in selecting candidates and effectively, making them the DA? Because a lot of times, historically, that's what would happen. But that may have been impacted by a lot of these progressive prosecutors running. What do you think about that?
I mean, listen, on the one hand, we have obviously come to a point where it's become obvious that a lot of arguments that 4 years ago would have seemed like non-starters in elections are actually very successful. We've seen that, and I think that's what's important to add to the context that I've said so far, especially for people who haven't followed this movement very closely.
Right.
That in the time between 2017, Krasner's first election, and today, it's been a sea change around the country. Just over the past couple of years, people who have won on platforms similar to Krasner include places like LA, places like New Orleans, Ann Arbor, parts of Arizona and Virginia, parts of Massachusetts, a lot of different cities, a lot of suburban areas. And so the context has changed a lot, right? On the other hand, we are still in a place where the mere fact that the police union is attacking someone, the mere fact that prosecutors within a DA's office is attacking the elected prosecutor is in and of itself enough to generate a wave of coverage that talks about the anxieties of towards criminal justice reform, as though we were still in the 80s, and that's also a reality. Like we really are seeing that right now in LA, where George Gascon, who's the elected DA of LA, who just won in November, ousting the incumbent DA there in November on a platform that's broadly speaking, let's say similar to Krasner's, if not on some aspects goes further. He has faced a lot of resistance from people who were already in the office. And if you look at the media coverage in LA, there's this like drip. There's this drip of ADAs, assistant prosecutors, people in the sheriff department, who are getting emotional in interviews with the media about the fact that they're no longer able to seek as high sentences or as high bail. And that in and of itself is a story, right? This prosecutor who is getting teary about not being able to seek the death penalty in a case. So that in and of itself is still there. And the expectation that Krasner would get more trouble than he ended up getting in the primary is indicative of that.
Right.
Right. And Daniel, since this was such an issue, just overall, and affected so many people, and obviously as in the election, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the homicide spike in 2020, right? So obviously opponents are going to blame that on progressive prosecutors, but what do the criminologists say about this, or what does the data point to so far? I know it's very early.
Yeah, I think this is going to not be an answer that is still very satisfying, but the answer seems to be that it's, as often with things that involve the crime rate going up or down, that there are no easy answers, and that studies are not very clear about what is behind it. What is clear in many ways is that the spike in violence and crime is impacting cities around the country, whether or not they're being governed by one of the DAs that I just mentioned, including in the few cities. I saw some statistics last week. There's only a few cities that have Republicans at the head, but those also have experienced a spike in crime. But I think what's and obviously this was a major issue in the Philly DA race, and will continue to be an issue in all these elections, as it should be. Very important things to talk about, obviously. But I think what's important, I think some of where the conversation doesn't really quite make sense how it's happening is that the conversation, sometimes it looks as though people think that criminal justice reform, that people only argue for criminal justice reform when crime is low. When a lot of the argument for reform, for abolition, wherever you are on that spectrum, is that the conventional approaches to incarceration and policing have failed at creating a safe society, right? And so it's not that criminal justice reformers are throwing their hands in the air and are saying, "Oh, the crime is spiking, so it's no longer our turn." On the contrary, a lot of the argument for people like Krasner right now is that it's mass incarceration, the way in which that has impoverished entire communities, that has put people in great straits. That all of that has something to do with how we think about safety as well. I mean, for instance, at some point, one of you mentioned probation rates in Philly, and that's a very important thing to think about, because Philly has one of the highest rates of probation in the country. So that means people who aren't in prison, so we don't really count them as incarcerated. Well, they're not. They shouldn't be counted as incarcerated, but yet they're under extreme amounts of supervision, and at the slightest trip up, they can be sent back to jail. So, right, those sort of approaches to how we think about crime and safety, the argument goes to people like Krasner, are part of what has caused American society to be broken in many ways. So I think that that's what's playing out right now. It's not an argument of whether, it's an argument of what is the best solution to these problems of violence, right? And Krasner got 85% yesterday in, for instance, in Philadelphia's Black wards. He got support kind of in a lot of the cities. So that's important to think about in terms of who is supporting him and what sort of arguments are resonating.
I really appreciate that answer, Daniel, because it's a lot of people sometimes when they're reading about crime stats, it's often missing the context and how difficult it is to actually give a reason why stats are going up or down or whatever. So really appreciate that. Just a last question, because I know we're going over. We obviously, Chris mentioned a lot of the policies that Krasner has enacted during his time as DA. What has he promised going forward?
Yeah, I think another, I'm not necessarily aware of things he has promised that are necessarily different than what he's doing. I think an interesting way of thinking about it is that there's a lot of space to his left, right? It's not, I think the way in which this ends up being covered is that there's Krasner, the radical DA, and then there's like the police union and conservative and the Trump administration and Bill Barr are attacking him, and so that's how I presented it as well, right? But if you look at how the very community organizations and grassroots groups like Reclaim Philly, the Abolitionist Law Center, a lot of groups are based in Philly and are very active. The Bell Fund in Philly, a lot of the groups that were very active in making the case that his policies are important to keep going forward have also been critics of his in many ways over the past few years, saying that he hasn't gone far enough in cutting pretrial detention, for instance, saying he hasn't gone far enough in protecting all immigrants from deportation. That's something I was talking about earlier as something he is extending to some defendants, but not all. Also, I mean, on probation, there's a lot of room to go further if you're talking about criminal justice reform. And what we're seeing around the country right now is many prosecutors who, in part inspired by Larry Krasner, have run on platforms that go beyond what he has proposed, right? Like in New York City has a DA race in a month, and many of the candidates there are saying are effectively have proposed lists of low-level offenses that they will that they won't charge at all, that they will not prosecute at all. So there's a lot of different things that are happening around the country that are changing the conversation. And I don't want to say that I've left Krasner behind, because that's not quite the right way to say it, but that have opened a lot of space to his left to have more conversations over the next 4 years. And I will add one thing, which is that Progressive actually we've been focused on the DA race here, but progressives had very good nights in Philly in other races as well, especially, which is very relevant here, elections for local judge. And I mentioned that because judges in Philly, in some cases, have blocked some of the proposals, some of the efforts by Krasner to lower bail or sentences in some cases, and groups and progressive groups in Philly were really focused this year on judge elections and endorsed a bunch of candidates, and 7 of the 8 candidates for local judge that they endorsed won yesterday as well. So that could also maybe change the dynamic, the system, the structure that Krasner is in, because it's not really about what he himself is doing, right? It's about the system is in and what different parts of the system are doing to one another. And there's new opportunities for that conversation over the next 4 years.
Great. Thanks for bringing that up, because that's another aspect, obviously, that's overlooked when we talk about criminal justice and elections. Daniel, we really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And just like we did with prison policy, we recommend everybody check out The Appeal. Your entire team does magnificent work over there, actually covering the policies. So we really appreciate your insights, and thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much.